The name Benedict Arnold has become synonymous with treason in the United States, and yet the full actions of the general and the extent of his treason is really little known among Americans. In a little remembered event 244 years ago, the people of Richmond, Virginia would learn the true extent to which the former American hero had switched sides. The 1781 raid on Richmond deserves to be remembered. Born in Connecticut in 1741, Benedict Arnold had deep roots in the American colonies, named after his great grandfather, Benedict Arnold I, who had been governor of the colony of Rhode Island in the Providence plantations. Through his mother's family, he shares ancestry with six U.S. presidents. At the age of 16, he served briefly, just 16 days, in a Connecticut militia unit during an aborted campaign in the French and Indian Wars, but he was not a soldier, but a merchant. It was the damage to his business from the Sugar and Stamp Acts that motivated him to join the American cause. He enlisted as a captain in the Connecticut militia, moved up the ranks quickly, and was present with Ethan Allen when he captured Fort Ticonderoga in May of 1775. He was the officer who tallied the artillery captured there, but he and Allen didn't get along. Arnold was promoted to brigadier general and led a disastrous attempt to take Quebec City, an action in which he was wounded in the leg. While he made some powerful friends, he also continued to make enemies among the leadership of the army. Although given command of the defense of Rhode Island and promoted to major general, he began to feel like he was being passed over and several times offered his resignation, only to be refused by General Washington. He distinguished himself in the Saratoga campaign, but clashed with former supporter General Horatio Gates. He showed prowess on the battlefield, but seemed even more skilled at making enemies within the army. Washington appointed him military governor of Philadelphia in 1778. Historian John Shai wrote on the 1999 American biography that it was one of the worst decisions of Washington's career. The impolitic Arnold clashed with local authority and business leaders, eventually leading to a court-martial and official reprimand. Among the complaints was his relatively lenient treatment of loyalists within the city. An investigation by Congress then faulted his accounting during the Saratoga campaign, arguing that he owed back $1,000. The problem was largely because of receipts that had been lost in the army's retreat, and again Arnold felt that he had been mistreated. He grew increasingly bitter about his treatment, having lost his business and been twice wounded in his service, and seemed to become increasingly convinced that he was being passed over for positions of command to less experienced officers. Some historians have argued that he was also being swayed by his new wife, Philadelphia socialite Peggy Shippen, who came from a loyalist family. His treacherous behavior, in violation of his oath of loyalty, apparently began in 1779. Working with a ring of spies, he used coded messages and intermediaries to give the British information on troop strength and positions. According to historian Karen Prince Hassel in her 2004 biography of Arnold, he was given the code names Monk and Mr. Moore. The reason for Benedict Arnold's treason is a matter of much discussion. Certainly there was a selfish financial incentive, but some authors suggest that there was also patriotism, as Arnold slowly became convinced that America has been better off before the chaos of the Revolution. He seems to have been convinced that Congress and Washington were not pursuing peace aggressively enough. While many of the problems that he encountered were the result of his own lack of tact, politics among the Continental Congress and Army were notoriously scheming and alienated many early patriots. While he was responsible for missteps, his prosecution for relatively trivial complaints could be seen as persecution. And then there was his wife. Pretty, vivacious, and 19 years his junior, he was clearly besotted and swayed by the young Tory. Historian W.D. Wetherell noted, simply, in American Heritage magazine in 2007, that Arnold married the wrong person. Although historian Willard Steer Randall wrote in his 1990 Arnold biography, Peggy Arnold's private encouragement of his secret negotiations to change sides was constantly being seconded by a Greek chorus of loyalists and conservative Philadelphia merchants and lawyers. In any case, in 1780, when Arnold was appointed commander to the strategically important fortifications at West Point, he began negotiations to give the position over to the British. Arnold famously wrote to Major John Andre, his go-between with General Henry Clinton in New York, "As life and everything is at stake, I shall expect some certainty, my property here secure, and a revenue equivalent to the risk and service done." The negotiations settled on the sum of 20,000 British pounds, a substantial amount worth nearly £4 million today. Arnold had extensive plans to weaken the defenses of West Point, a critical fortification protecting the Hudson River Valley. But the plot was betrayed. Andre was intercepted by three militiamen who found papers from Arnold hidden in his stocking. Andre was hanged, but Arnold received word ahead of time that the papers were being sent to Washington and escaped. He was never paid the £20,000 for the failed plot, receiving instead £6,315 and a pension. That is the relatively well-known part of the story, but the story didn't end there. Arnold was rewarded for his decision by the British, who gave him a commission as a brigadier general. If his hope was to escape the politics that had plagued him in the Continental Army, he would be disappointed. Arnold found little support among British officers, many of whom questioned his value and blamed him for the death of Major Andre. Randall wrote, "It offended many career British officers that the erstwhile rebel should have superiority over a German corporal." He began raising a force of loyalists consisting of deserters from the Continental Army named the American Legion. While Washington saw the British trust in so infamous a character to be folly, Arnold's efforts were successful enough to persuade Washington to approve a plot to have Arnold kidnapped, although the plot didn't have time to hatch before Arnold's next adventure. General Clinton was sending Arnold with 1,600 troops to attack the Virginia capital of Richmond. Clinton chose Arnold and his loyalist troops because he was optimistic that they would find support among the population there. Historian Mark Edward Lender wrote in a 2017 edition of the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, "The Virginia campaign was an intensely personal test for Arnold. Till 1780, he had inspired soldiers to fight for the Revolution. But could he now convince them to take up arms against it? Perhaps even end the Revolution? That is, could he rally Americans, whom Arnold claimed were weary and dismayed with the patriot cause, to the royal standard in such numbers that reconciliation with the empire could become a reality?" The attack was well timed. Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson had moved the capital of Virginia from Williamsburg to Richmond. Ostensibly, he did so because it was more centrally located and defensible. But there was another motive. The American Battlefield Trust notes, however, a major deciding factor in moving the capital to Richmond for Jefferson was support for the Revolution. Richmond housed fewer loyalists compared to Williamsburg. But Clinton had reason to believe that Virginia was vulnerable. The greater portion of the regular troops had been captured at the May 1780 Battle of Charleston. The Virginia militia was struggling with recruiting, and Virginia had precious few troops to defend itself. Lender writes, "The long absence of direct British threats had produced complacency among local patriots. Militia discipline was lax, and Governor Thomas Jefferson and most state legislators had misjudged the military situation." The Richmond Times-Dispatch wrote in 2025, "Arnold's force of about 1,600 British regulars, American-born loyalists, and German Jaegers landed in Virginia, hoping to destroy rebel supply lines and wreak havoc along the James River to distract the colonial armies from British General Charles Cornwallis's campaign in the Carolinas." Richmond had generally been free from the war and was defended only by militia, and they clearly weren't expecting a fight. A 1952 edition of the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography explains, "About one half of Arnold's force were American loyalists. Happy with his separate command, Arnold was ready to mete out revenge to the Patriots, now his enemies. This was to be a raid which promised a fortune and happy prize money. Since Loyalist property was frequently looted, if not entirely confiscated, Loyalist troops of Arnold's army must have welcomed an opportunity for retribution." The Edinburgh Advertiser reported at the time, "The 4th, the fleet proceeded to Westham, about 140 miles from the Capes in Virginia, which they reached without opposition, the militia that was collected having everywhere fled on their approach." American Battlefield Trust writes, "The recent traitor to the Patriots sailed along the James River towards Richmond. For 3 consecutive days, Arnold and his new fleet laid waste to colonial plantations and settlements along the James River." The Trust writes that Richmond was defended by a thin force of 200 militiamen. When Arnold's force confronted the 200 militiamen, the militia fired an abysmal musket volley and fled into the woods. Jefferson quickly left with the government. The Trust writes, "Jefferson saw the militiamen flee and called for a mass evacuation of military supplies as well as government officials from the city. When Arnold marched into Richmond, he was met with no resistance. Arnold sent word to Jefferson, offering to spare the city if Jefferson allowed British vessels to come in unmolested and take the city's tobacco stores, but Jefferson refused. On January 6, 1781, Arnold ordered the city of Richmond burned." The Virginia Magazine of History and Biography writes, "Arnold made the citizens of Richmond feel the weight of his hand. The town was delivered over to plunder, and many public and private buildings, including a range of warehouses replete with the staple commodity of Virginia, perished in the flames. There never, it is written, was such a smell of tobacco in Richmond before or since, down to the time of the burning of the city in 1865 on its evacuation by Jefferson Davis." The American Battlefield Trust writes Arnold's men set fire to homes, businesses, government buildings, and robbed the city of all it owned. Jefferson got word of the destruction of Richmond and was outraged. Jefferson placed a bounty of 5,000 gold for Arnold's capture and rallied Virginia militia to pursue Arnold, harassing his slowly exhausting troops with the Battlefield Trust rights and a regular style of war formulated by Continental Major General Nathaniel Greene. The website of the Colonial National Historical Site writes Washington, intent on bringing Arnold in, sent Lafayette with about 1,200 troops and support from a small French fleet. Arnold retreated to Portsmouth. Arnold was replaced by Major General William Phillips and then by Lord Cornwallis, and the war moved south. Arnold's invasion had certainly been a success in a tactical sense, but it had an element of failure as well. Lender writes that Arnold's Virginia campaign remains misunderstood. The Standard account has Arnold rampaging and plundering up and down the James River, including a raid on Richmond, leaving fire and destruction in his wake. This article, however, argues that this traditional view is mistaken, factually and interpretively. In fact, Lender writes, contrary to the assertions of many contemporary and historical accounts, his conduct was quite restrained and in keeping with his conciliatory intent. Lender notes that in a note to inhabitants of Richmond and Manchester, he proposed that owners of prized goods such as tobacco, rum, wine, sugar, molasses, sailcloth, and coffee obtain permission from Virginia authorities to deliver them to the British Army, and Arnold would pay half the current market value. And the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography wrote in 1952 that a Richmond jailer and a deputy quartermaster wrote on January 6th that the British were by no means indiscriminate in their destruction of Richmond, noting that the people's effects are as yet unmolested. Rather, Lender writes, the larger effect was on Arnold's thinking, something he calls a traitor's epiphany. He had shown restraint in his operations and stayed the hardest hand of warfare against Virginians. And for what? Despite his best efforts, and he had tried hard, he had changed few minds. The magic of his name had vanished, and Patriot leaders even decried the turncoat's infamy in efforts to rally Virginians against the British invasion. This understanding transformed his sense of self. Only extinguishing the rebel cause would vindicate his reputation. This epiphany would show in the difference in the way he handled his next command, an attack on New London, Connecticut. Lender writes, Arnold confirmed his reputation for villainy on 6 September 1781, when he led a major raid into his home state of Connecticut. Lender describes the raid as viciously efficient. Over the course of the day, his command virtually destroyed the town, burning some 140 buildings, including private homes, warehouses, commercial facilities, and docks. Arnold returned to London seeking another military command, but he was never fully trusted and he was rebuffed. He joined the Tories that were trying to convince the king to continue the war after Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, but of course that cause failed. The Albany New York Times Union said that historians have described his time after the war of one of disappointment, controversy, and legal entanglements. He died in 1801, shortly after his 60th birthday. Randall writes as much a result of his chronic frustration and rage at his own impotence as of the combination of severe gout and dropsy that London doctors had diagnosed. Some historians recently have been kinder to Arnold, but his reputation as America's greatest traitor remains. And ironically, in Richmond, Virginia, the place where perhaps he himself came to grips with that reputation, his role is largely forgotten, overshadowed by the Civil War history of that city. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.